So whenever there's a big foreign policy debate, especially about a place like Venezuela, you hear this warning over and over again. The US has tried this before. But what does that really mean? Today, we're going to unpack the history behind that single phrase and see why the ghost of past interventions looms so large over what's happening right now.
And this quote, it really gets right to the heart of it. It's a heavy statement, you know? It points to this long, messy history of American interventions that just did not go the way they were planned. And that history is exactly why conversations about places like Venezuela get so intense so fast.
So that's the big question, right? How does a history of US actions in places like Iraq or Vietnam or right there in Latin America, how does all that shape the way we talk about Venezuela today? That's the connection we're here to explore. Okay, first things first. We need to get on the same page with a key term. When you hear the phrase regime change, it's easy to just picture tanks rolling down a street. But the reality is, it's a much broader and way more complicated idea than that.
Think of regime change as a whole spectrum of actions. On one end, yeah, you have full-on military invasions and covert CIA-backed coups. But it can also be a lot less direct. Things like funding opposition groups or applying really intense, crippling economic sanctions. The key is that it's any major effort from the outside to fundamentally change who's in charge of a country.
But how do you even define success here? I mean, getting a leader out of power, that's one thing. But the real metric, the one that history actually judges, is what comes after. Do you get a stable, functioning government in its place? This is that crucial second step where so often the whole story just completely falls apart. So let's actually see this pattern in action. We're going to look at 5 key historical examples. And for people who are critical of these interventions, these aren't just random events. They see them as data points that show a really troubling trend. Let's kick it off with Vietnam. The goal was pretty clear: prop up South Vietnam to keep the communist North from taking over. But after years of war and immense cost in lives and money, U.S. forces pulled out. And what happened? The political system they had supported for decades just crumbled. It became the textbook example of how even overwhelming military power doesn't guarantee you'll get the political outcome you want. Then you've got the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba. This was a direct attempt to get rid of Fidel Castro, and it was a complete, catastrophic failure. It's also a perfect example of unintended consequences. The failed invasion actually made Castro stronger and pushed him right into a tight alliance with the Soviet Union, which, of course, just escalated the whole Cold War. Now, for an entire generation, Iraq in 2003 is the defining example. Removing Saddam Hussein's regime was, from a purely military standpoint, incredibly fast. But what happened next? A massive power vacuum that unleashed years of brutal sectarian violence, a long and bloody insurgency, and it ultimately created the perfect conditions for the rise of ISIS. The lesson here? Toppling the statue was the easy part. Next up, let's look at Libya in 2011. A NATO-led intervention helped rebels overthrow Muammar Gaddafi. And again, the initial goal was achieved, but with absolutely no real plan for the day after, the country just shattered. It descended into a chaotic civil war between rival governments and militias that's still going on. It's a really stark warning about what happens when you intervene without a plan for what comes next. And finally, Afghanistan. This wasn't some short-term operation. This was a 20-year nation-building project. After trillions of dollars and 2 decades of effort, U.S. forces withdrew in 2021. And the government that America had sponsored, it collapsed almost overnight. And the Taliban, the very same group that was removed back in 2001, just walked right back into power. Now, while those examples are global, this issue of intervention has a particularly painful and specific history in Latin America. For countries in this region, this isn't just some theoretical concern, it's written into their national memory, into their scars. I mean, the pattern is it's brutal, and it's clear. In Guatemala, a CIA-backed coup in 1954 was followed by 36 years of a vicious civil war. In Chile, a 1973 coup brought in the brutal dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet. In Nicaragua in the 80s, U.S. support for the Contra rebels just fueled a devastating conflict. So you can start to see why, for many in the region, any kind of U.S. pressure feels like an existential threat. So, okay, let's bring all this history, all these ghosts, back to where we started, Venezuela. How does this whole legacy of failed interventions and long-term chaos shape the debate we're having today?
Now, it is really, really important to make a distinction here. What's happening in Venezuela is not a carbon copy of Iraq or Afghanistan. There has been no military invasion. The pressure has mostly been through things like sanctions, diplomacy, and legal actions. But, and this is a big but, even with those key differences, those historical alarm bells are ringing loud and clear for many observers.
So why? Well, it's because critics are drawing directly on the lessons we just covered. They argue that sometimes intense external pressure can totally backfire. It can let a leader rally support against a quote-unquote foreign enemy. They warn that if the regime did actually collapse, the power vacuum that follows could be even more chaotic and violent. And above all, history shows over and over again that the road from authoritarianism to a stable democracy is almost never quick, and it is certainly never clean. So as we wrap this up, what is the single most important lesson to take away from all this complicated history? It's not as simple as saying intervention is always right or always wrong. The real lesson is a lot more nuanced than that.
The common misconception, the easy soundbite, is just that the U.S. always fails at regime change. But the real lesson from history is more specific. The military or political act of removing a leader, that's often doable. The true consistent point of failure is in totally underestimating and mismanaging the aftermath. It's the what comes next part that always proves to be the most difficult, and often the most destructive phase. And that's why all this history matters so much in the debate over Venezuela. The ghosts of Vietnam, of Iraq, of Libya, and so many other places, they serve as this constant, sobering reminder. A reminder that the immense human and political cost of getting it wrong, well, it's not a theory. It is already written in incredible detail into the pages of history.